The wind that came off the wolfswood was full of the sea, though the sea lay leagues away, a ghost of brine in the breath of snow. Theon Greyjoy tasted it on his tongue as the flakes gathered in his beard and on the dark fur at his shoulders. Pine boughs creaked and whispered around him, lacing the whitened sky with black fingers. Night would be hard and blue and long when it finally fell, but the day itself had turned to a kind of milky dusk, light scattering in the air as if the world had been ground to frost and blown about by some patient giant. He did not shiver. He had learned, in the cellars and kennels and winter yards of other men, the uselessness of shivering. Learned to set his jaw against the clack of his own teeth and make of his body a quieter thing. Snow crusted his cheeks and he let it, as he let so many things, settle and stay. The tree waited for him among the older pines, where the ground rose and the drifts thinned and the wind ran sharper between trunks. Its face was long with age and weather, its seeded mouth a pulp of old carved wounds, lips red with saps that looked like clotted blood. Above, red leaves clung in cheeky defiance of the season, a scatter of hands against the white. The exposed roots were as big around as Theon's leg. A nest of serpents plunging into the dark earth. Men told stories of such trees, and boys too. And the wrong sort of men said them aloud. But the old gods had never taken Theon's fear from him. It was other gods he had been taught to fear. The ones that called him down into the cold green light under waves that pressed like slabs of lead. He thought of the drowned god as a weight above him, not beneath him. Water everywhere, like winter everywhere. But here there was a hush to the air. The hush of a long watcher. He knelt. His knees sank to the crust's harder layer, then slipped to the powder beneath. When he put his shoulders back, the scars across them complained, a tightness in the skin as if stitched there by a mean-handed tailor. He did not wince. He folded his hands and realized, again, as he often did, that the fingers he expected were not there. The cold crept easily into the absence, and there, at least, it found less flesh to bite. I was wrong, he told the thing that had no ears. He waited for the leaves to respond, and they did not. Wind did, though, and old pine needles skittered across the snow like cockroaches startled in a baker's pantry. I was wrong in a boy's ways, and a man's ways both. I thought myself both things at once, and neither of them true. I took a house that was a home, and I made it a lie. I did worse. I put that lie in the ground, and lit the earth above it, and gave it names that were not its names. He thought of two little bodies in winter brown clothes, the smell of singed hair that he had not been able to escape for a week. He heard the voices that had begged him. Not theirs. Others. All others. Servants and small folk with the courage that comes to the frightened when they are pressed to a wall. Their faces had blurred into one long line of eyes he could not look at. The first time someone had called him prince afterward, he had swallowed the word, and it had cut his throat on the way down. There had been a time when he had liked the taste of prince, had rolled it under his tongue like a sweet. The wolf's castle had been his accuser, its stones all eyes as well. I know, he said. That saying so does not unmake it. I know that even forgetting does not unmake it. I tried forgetting. I wore it like another's name. He found his mouth twitching and pressed it steady. I do not want forgetfulness anymore. I want another thing. I would ask it as a child asks it, if that were allowed me. Now. He leaned forward until his forehead touched the bark, and he breathed in wood and damp, and the faintest ferment of something living under ice. He did not think the tree would answer. He did not truly know what he would do if it did. When he lifted his head, a bit of snow crushed and slid off the carved cheek like a tear. Downslope, the bells on the bridles shook. Theon stood and turned and watched as the horsemen came single file through the close-set trunks, the white muffling their approach and puffing at their flanks like steam. The base camp burned beyond. Faint smoke, a gray column against the clouded sky. Men were small in this country, he thought. Men were always small when the air had a mind to be clean. At the fore rode a woman with a black braid and a cloak the color of crows. Her cheeks were round and wind-pink, and her eyes a shade too pale to be called kind. He had learned, too, that kindness was not a color that could be seen from a horse's back. Alison Mormont did not dismount. She eyed the weirwood, and then him. You talk to trees. she said. She spoke in a voice with a hint of the shore to it, the bearkin of the north like the Ironborn in that regard. We talk to bears. Both listen when it pleases them. I am poor company for men, Theon said, and let the words fall flat. I have not asked for a bear. She made a sound like a laugh and like spitting. The king sent me. He tires of being told to wait by a man who belongs to another god and another lord. Benshan. His god will forgive the waiting to spare him the taste of folly, Theon said. His smile when he found it was threadbare. I would take your king to the coast when the snow eases. I would take him to stones that receive iron feet without sinking. I would take him to words that have waited as long as the tree here has waited. Then he may decide what he prefers to do with me. You speak as if you have the north salt in your mouth, she said. We have watched Ironborn come and go on the stony shore since before my mother's mother lived. They take what they can carry and leave what they cannot. They are a kind of wind. But the winter is a heavier thing than a mere wind, Greyjoy. It does not blow past, it settles. Theon nodded. Then we must make something from the settling, or it will make something of us. You sound like a maester. Do not. She jerked her chin toward the cards and riders following. Come. The king will hear you himself. If you are very lucky, he will scowl less than usual. Menmishwar. I am not lucky, Theon said, and stepped away from the weirwood. The sound of the snow beneath his boots was a muffled crunch, like the chewing of old bread. He put one hand to the trunk in passing, as a man touches the lintel of a house he does not own but has slept in once. They rode close, all of them, for the path had narrowed where the pines leaned inward, and the drifts had piled higher between them. Theon's horse was a shag-bellied mare with a temper like cool ash. She did not start or flare at the shadows. A man might learn to love such an animal without ever knowing it, and that seemed to Theon like the safest way. When the trunks parted and the camp opened its brown and gray and slush before them, it seemed to him very briefly as if he had been here a long time already, as if the snow had begun to wear him like a small rock wears a channel underneath a roofie. Smoke. Men with red ears and cracked knuckles. Slush churned to gray soup studded with old manure. The banners were limp cloth on crosspieces, as if they were bodies hung to dry. He found Stannis Baratheon in the largest tent, which was more like a low house of sacking, its poles thick and its lamps steady against the draught. Heat pouched there like a sullen cat. If you tossed it a little wood, it stayed and glared at you. The king was as Theon remembered him, a narrow mouth, a brow like the edge of a shelf, hands that seemed forever on the cusp of closing into fists, and then remembered their business and stayed fingers instead. Out of courtesy or cold, the king had not removed his gloves. He kept the hood of his cloak thrown back so his face could frown at the light and be seen doing it. Beside him at the trestle table leaned Davos Seaworth, who had the air of a man who never entirely rested the weight of himself on anything he owned. He was patient in a way that made other men's patience look like a way of going to sleep. Theon felt the rare pull of it and managed to dislike him less for it than he might have otherwise. As if the tree itself had a voice, Stannis was saying to Alysanne Mormont. The words snugly fitted the shape of him. Men who ask woods for counsel come away with splinters. They come away with patience sometimes, Alysanne returned. And winter's not a splinter, your grace. It's a stake. Better to drive it where it hurts least. Stannis noticed Theon then, because Stannis noticed everything. His eyes took the measure of the Ironborn, and found him wanting as always, then found in that want some use. You've supped with the old gods, he said without invitation. I've supped with hunger, Theon said. I go where the bowl is held out. The trees had good manners today. They are not gods, Stannis said. They are older than my manners. That is near enough, Theon returned, and saw Davos' mouth try on a laugh, and put it away again, not out of fear of his king, but prudence. Get on with it, Stannis said. I have men to keep warm, and food argues with the numbers. If you have a scheme, say it. If you have a prayer, keep it. We do war here, not worship. Theon bowed his head because a man did not look at a storm and tell it what shape to take. You have Asha Greyjoy in irons, he said. You have Ironborn scattered from the stony shore to Deepwood, and you have their captains listening in one ear for the creak of a king's rope, and in the other for their gods. What you do not have yet is the winter sea letting you pass, and you will need that if you are to lay a hand on the Dreadfort from more than one side, and if you are to lay any hands at all on what came down from the north beyond men." In the pause, the trestle creaked as weight shifted. Alysanne watched without blinking for longer than was comfortable, which he understood was a courtesy of hers, a way to measure another's stillness. "The Ironborn," Stannis said flatly, "do not keep faith. They take. They boast and drown and call it virtue. I have sworn men stripping them from our trees in the crook of night, like bad apples. They break lines of wagons that bring my army food. They do not keep other men's faith," Theon allowed, keeping Stannis' gaze and letting his head stay unbowed now that the worst of his proposal had been spoken. "They keep their own to their own gods and their own proud words. The Ironborn will never bend to you as a knot bends to a knife, but they will bow for their own reasons. They will bow if it is to save their people from a winter that kills without even hating. They will bow if you let them call it theirs to do. And they will bow if you let them call it theirs to do. And they will bow to Asha if she chooses to bend them. She is the only one left who can. The reader on Harlow saw." He left Euron's name unsaid, left it coiled like a storm at the horizon. "It must be Asha. You came a long way to ask me to free an enemy captor and call it strategy," Stannis said. His mouth twitched. Theon did not flatter himself that it had anything but bitterness in it. "Tell me why I should not put your head on a pole and send that ahead to her, as a way of telling Ironborn what faith looks like when men keep it." "Because my head is no prize in the north," Theon said. "But my voice is still a key in the islands. And because it costs you more to fight 2 wars, while winter eats our horses from the inside out, than it does to hold your nose and make one. Let me speak for you as I speak for them. Let me carry words that say this: we pull Ironborn out of the woods, but we set them to sea with oaths. They return our river towns unburnt, untouched, and in exchange they are allowed to dock at coves named and few. In exchange they carry food to your camps and your allies. They ferry men across frozen shallows. They falter the Dreadfort from the shore and carry flame where the Boltons think their winter walls stand. They keep their axes on ships and their hands off Northmen children. For each oath they give, one of ours lives, and for each they break. One of theirs hangs from a bear's tree, and not a one shrugs at it because the gallows rope will have our kin's knot on it. You hold hostages, good ones. Let them be honored and afraid." "Bow." Alysanne's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "You think we would stomach their stink at our moorings? You think we would watch Kraken banners lift in our coves and not think of the old women drowned for their amusement? The girls dragged out of berry thickets and made to cry at the surf? Nenda Rhino. I think you live on an island with too few men to waste on a war that can be turned," Theon said. At that, she laughed for true, and he took heart that he needed not mind how he bled if it fed the thing he asked for. Davos' voice came like a rope thrown across waters that had begun to churn. "Your Grace, there is sense in this that has no liking for itself. The winter roads are a miserable jest. We run our wagons on prayers and curses and the backs of men, and we break both. The shore will not freeze as fast. The tide needs no ox to push it. If we could count on a season's worth of food moving by water, we'd be men again, not mules. To move men by water too. I know what we say of Ironborn, but I've known a few that made a bargain and kept it if you nailed its edges down so tight they could not find a way to wriggle. And the lass?" He meant Asha, Theon knew. "Seems fashioned of different iron than the rest of that rusted lot. She talks like a captain and stands like one. She sees the bigger ship, I think, not just the wave that's trying to drown her." "Menderwan Shan. Do you understand?" Stannis said to Theon. "What you ask your sister to lose by bending to any knot of mine, I ask my sister to save what can be saved," Theon answered. "She will count it the same. She is not soft. And you," Stannis said. "I am not anything," Theon answered, and watched the remarks fly like startled birds across both Stannis and Davos' faces. One rigid with disapproval, the other with pity he did not need. "I am here," Theon said, "which is enough for the use you might have of me." The king looked at Alysanne. The queen's man in him weighed the old gods and found them wanting. The iron in him weighed difficulty and found it delicious. The man in him perhaps weighed food and flame and winter and found himself almost human a moment. He slashed his hand. "Bring her," he said, and Alysanne nodded and went, and the cold seemed to grow sharper in the tent for a moment, as if eager for a look at what old enmities might do when set next to each other like dogs on a chain. They brought Asha Greyjoy in with her wrists bound and her ankles free, 2 bears at her back, because bears respect other hunters and also do not trust them. She had lost weight since Theon had last truly seen her, and her hair had been hacked without care, and she had a scar high on her forehead that would leave a pale crooked horn when the sun came back. She met her brother's gaze the way a captain looks at a strange sail. Her mouth quirked, and he could not tell what humor it found in him, only that it found some. She smelled faintly of salt, as if her clothing remembered better days. "You look like yourself again," she said, because she was his sister and would say what others would not. "So they tell me," he returned. "Do you, little brother?" Her head tilted. "Who do you tell yourself you are?" He thought of all the names. They were all correct and incorrect. "Hungry," he said, and she snorted and half smiled for the first honest time, as if the old game of answering with a wrong true thing pleased her still. Stannis' discomfort grew the way his patience grew, tightening itself into usefulness. "Lady Asha," he said, because he was stubborn enough to wrap an honorific around a woman Ironborn who would spit it back. "We have business. Your brother claims you could strike a truce with the North that would keep your people from our trees and put them at sea for us, as partners with a rope over their heads for cheer. I know your kind does not love a rope. Will you do this thing and make it hold? If I do mine." Asha's eyes flicked to Theon once, quick as a gull's dip. When she spoke, the sea came more strongly into the tent than it had yet that day. "I can set oaths in the mouths of captains who want their children alive when spring shows her teeth again. I can call the Botleys and the Good Brothers, and maybe even that sullen knot of Saltcliffe idiots to sit and listen at least. The reader will listen because he likes the sound of words. The Danfair will not come. Euron will come only to take the tent and set it on fire. But Euron is far, or close only if the wind wants pain. If there is bread in this bargain and salt in it, and the taste of getting our feet back on decks and our hands back on lines, I can hold more of them than I cannot. And if you, Black-browed King, can hold your Northmen away from stringing every lad of the islands from pine boughs until they creak like bells in a wedding wind, then I can try. And if I see some of your rope knotted around my people where it need not be, I will string it around the neck of any man I can, and call it an honest day's work." She smiled again, and there was nothing soft in it. "No offense meant. You don't look like a man who cares for that sort of thing." Davos made a soft sound in his throat that might have been a strangled plea for caution. Stannis stared at Asha as he would at a puzzle that had been carved with hostile intention. "I would set hostages," he said. "They would be honored and kept." Asha returned coolly, glancing at Alysanne as if to say, "Will your honor hold your hands as steady as your knives?" "They would be watched," Alysanne said, "by women who remember all the faces your folk took. Honored does not mean fooled." Asha rolled her shoulders against the ropes. "We can do this," she told Theon, as if the others were wind and tents and rumor. "But if you think it will be songs, you are less yourself than the last time I measured you. It will be old wounds reopening and fresh ones like snow on raw skin. There will be 100 insults in 100 mouths and 200 hands wanting axes and finding oars instead. There will be girls on the North Shore who will not be able to see the difference between what we say we are now and what we were. You will." She cocked her head. "Can you stand that long?" Theon found that the tree had made him able to say this with a plain voice. "Yes." A hush fell that was not silence, but the kind of listening that happens when men are quiet and the world puts its ear to their latched mouths. Stannis tapped 2 fingers on the trestle, as if he was a drummer timing a siege. He looked to Davos, and Davos gave him a single nod, as tiny as a prayer. "We will try it," Stannis said then, as if he hated the taste, and yet found it medicine. "If I am mocked for it, I will mock those men with the meat their families put in their bellies because I kept faith with sense. Asha Greyjoy, I will give you parole for 1 day and then another the day after, so long as you sit with my men and write the words the captains must hear and put your name to them in a hand. You will not run. You will eat what we eat and drink what we drink. You will. Not even a little? Asha asked, sweet and false. No, Stannis said. Ah, your north is no fun at all. Asha sighed. I'll do it. Theon will speak with me and carry some letters where a Greyjoy hand must carry, and not a bare hand. Bah. You will be watched, Stannis said to Theon. I am watched, Theon said, and thought of eyes in every stone in Winterfell, and of eyes on the surf at Lordsport, and of the blue eyes far away that looked through the cold as through glass. There is nowhere I am not. They set them to work in a smaller tent, which Alysanne had insisted be pitched near the bears and not the krakens. A writing board was made by laying a shield across 2 stumps. Theon watched Asha's hand move. He would have known her scrawl if he had found it painted under a harbor, piling 30 years from now. The line of it as sharp as a north wind where it turns and takes your breath for an extra heartbeat. Davos, who had kept books with ink he could hardly afford, found a smoother hand to copy in, and the 2 of them together made something like a treaty that had the awkward angles of a boat built in a kitchen. They phrased it in Ironborn terms where their pride required it. Rights of anchorage at named coves, rights to fish under truce for the length of a winter, named by a weirwood's leaf fall and return. They phrased it in Northmen terms where their anger required it. No raiding, no taking, no song of victory sung within a mile of any farm. They turned to Stannis terms with this pleasure and discovered that the man had a gift for being hated fairly. The hostages would be boys and girls both, chosen from the best families of the islands. But they would be treated as wards and taught spear and letters, and the customs of guest, right in houses where men remembered their names and their fathers' names, and did not flinch from speaking them. In return, Northmen wards would go to the islands, to be taught knots and weathers, and how to put their backs into an oar without plucking them from their mothers at midnight. For every oath break, an equivalent number of the opposite side's wards would be brought home in shame and replaced at once, with their name marked in a ledger that would not allow them to hold office for a generation. As for breaking the worst oaths, rape, murder under guest right, the burning of a hall with a child inside, there was no ledger for that, only rope and iron and fire. And in the making of that sentence, Alysanne Mormont and Asha Greyjoy had looked at each other and found an agreement that made men outside the tent shiver though the wind had dropped. They lit a brazier and warmed the ink and sealed the letters with whatever seals they possessed. Stannis' stag Davos candle, Alysanne's bear, Asha's knife tip pressed through the wax like a captain's oath. The ravens took some of them, and the riders took others. And to the sea, they gave 2 to be cast into a bottle, and thrown from the stony shore with the outgoing. Asha had insisted. Some of ours will read the sea before they read your papers, she said, and no one laughed because it was simply true. Theon watched the bottle roll and glitter and then be lost, and he thought of the weirwood's mouth and how it had collected the shape of so many words that men had exhaled in that place, and how none of them had been eaten by the tree. On the 3rd day, men from Deepwood Motte came into the camp to say that the Ironborn garrison there had taken down 2 kraken banners and rolled them tight and stacked them in a chest as if storing winter quilts, and had hung out a white cloth cut from a sail. Christopher Botley had sent word that he would parley under the heart tree in the ruined Godswood behind the fallen palisade. Stannis' men read that as insolence. Alysanne read it as a kind of courtesy Ironborn would recognize. They went with 12 each, north and island, and no more, and left the horses hobbled, as if in proof that no one would run. Theon could feel the old wood of Deepwood's timbers hum under his boots when he crossed them, and he remembered the press of trunks when he had come here once before. The Godswood behind it was bare of anything but the heart tree and the season's junk of twigs and snow and a few bones. He did not ask whose they were. Christopher Botley was still broad across the shoulders, with the hands of a man who preferred ropes to quills. He had gone gray in a year as men do when winter and worry hold them in a vice. He looked at Theon and Asha both with the face of a cousin who has the right to judge you, because you share a grandfather. "This is a trick," he said, because he would say what the men behind him expected in the first breath. So the second could be something else. "The North greases our palms with talk so we can lay our axes down and give them our wrists." "The North has axes too," Alysanne said. "And we have an army. If we wanted your wrists, we would not paint them with words. We would take them. What we want is better." "What we want," Asha said, stepping forward so he could see the rope still tied loose around her wrists, "is children not crying for bread with mouths that look like their fathers. What we want is a war that can be fought on the place where we fight best, instead of dragging us into the woods so the trees can laugh. You will do this because you have gone fishing in winter, and you know what it is to listen for ice." "Bah." He scratched at his beard, where the salt had collected like shore foam in a net. "And if Lord Manderley and the Glover come to us with red eyes and red hands," he said to Theon, "will you stand there between?" "Yes," Theon said. He did not add that he had stood in worse places than between two men and their hatred. There are places in a soul that are not for telling. You show them by being there when the blades come out and not running. A woman in Christopher's shadow spoke then. She had her hair bound back with a bit of sail twine and her cheeks were red raw from windburn. "What about the damn fair?" she asked in a half-worried defiance. "What about Aeron? He says a wave cannot be caught by this kind of paper. He says we have turned our backs already by writing it." Asha shrugged. "Aeron is a priest. He sees waves and thinks of drowning. I see a wave and think of riding it. I say, we build a raft. A good one. And I say we lash it to the Norse and call it a ship. Then?" Christopher thought long enough that several of the bearmen scuffed their boots and cleared their throats, and a raven somewhere said its name until it sounded like a wrong answer. He nodded once then. "We can try it. Not because the North has scared us, though you have. And may you be proud of that," he said to Alysanne without malice. "Not because your king stares like a judge at a fair, though he does. We will try it because the old men in the villages have been stealing wood from the boats for their fires. We will try it because when I lie down at night I hear nothing anymore. No gulls, no water. I hear only my wife breathing, and it makes me afraid, because if she stops, I do not know what sound will come next. I would hear waves again, and I would hear laughing. We have not heard laughter often this winter." He turned his head to the heart tree. "We have your tree and our sea. We will promise on both." They made a ritual of it because men are children even when they can shave. Davos, who had been a smuggler and a knight and a father, understood this and smudged soot with his thumb on the edge of the shield they used for a table, as if drawing a circle that could hold all of them inside for one long breath. Alysanne took out a skin of salted water and sprinkled it on the snow in a line between the two groups, and Asha pushed her toe through it and laughed low. "See? I have crossed your line and the world has not ended." Then Davos used his knife to cut his palm and hold it over the salted line so that the drops fell into brine and not onto the virgin snow. It smelled like iron and the sea both. Alysanne did the same. Christopher scowled and did not like it, but did it. Theon held up his maimed hand and pressed it in the salted snow and let the sting make up what the blood could not. The air gathered itself and pressed down briefly, as if the sky itself had leaned closer to look at their ugliness and their courage, and had found both interesting enough to stay a moment more. When it was done, the hardest part began. Men are fine at oaths. It is the living by them that works the bones into powder. The first quarrel was an old woman on the stony shore who would not see that a kraken on a ship was different from a kraken in her cabbage patch. She planted her boots and said she would rather eat snow than take an Ironborn fish. Asha went herself and sat on the woman's bench and asked her how many children she had lost, and the woman counted them with a finger that trembled, and Asha counted the cousins she had lost and the friends and the way a sea takes people without asking for reasons. When they had counted for a full half hour and were both crying in a manner that would have embarrassed them the day before, They made a stew together of cabbage and crab, and rubbed each other's cheeks dry, and told a boy to stop standing by the door like a frog on a stump, and bring more wood. The second quarrel was 3 Ironborn lads who had never seen a bear, and thought that poking one on a little island with a stick was a good story for girls. The bear bit one across the ribs, and the Northmen laughed until they were scolded, and Alicent stood over the wounded boy, and told him that she would set him to cleaning fish guts for a month if he looked sideways again at any creature that could tear the face from his skull faster than a wave overturns a dinghy. Stannis, to his credit and his own displeasure, kept his men where he said he would. And when a party of glovers came riding hard to demand blood for a cousin who had been made into a song last year by Ironborn on an open beach, he met them with a list of names and a line of rope, and did not smile as he explained how a royal pardon can sit like a stone in the mouth, heavy and helpful both, and how they would do no hanging toddy because he had hung enough. Heavy and helpful book. In time, the glovers went away angry in a useful way rather than the useless kind. They went to mend walls and count spears, and talk about the night instead of shouting about the day 2 winters past. Davos used ships that were still half frozen to move sacks of grain down from White Harbor, and he used Ironborn to crew them, and Northmen to unload them. And in the doing of it, the 2 sets of men learned how the other swore and laughed, and which songs they ruined on purpose, and which they sang while thinking themselves unwatched. The letters went out to Pike and Harlaw and Old Wick. Some came back on wings and some did not. One came back cut into thin strips and tied together again inside a piece of driftwood. The Ironborn way of telling another captain that his words had been read in good humor and would be obeyed until they were not. Asha took that one and nodded at the art of it, and cut its knot and put its strips in new order, and sent it to Lordsport, where someone would nail it to a beam in the alehouse, and make a story out of it for men who like to drink their courage. From Harlaw there came a careful reply that was not a reply, full of speculative paragraphs about the advantage of a temporary peace in light of a larger looming threat that turned all men's heads east, and the reader's hand had drawn a little map in the margin to show how a unity of convenience might move like a school of fish around got larger ships. Asha wrote back a line that said, "A school of fish moves by moving. Watch us." From Old Wick there came nothing, and that was its own answer. From Pike there came 2 letters, one written in a smooth clerk's hand and signed incredibly by men who were not Greyjoys, and yet bore names that had the weight of old stone. Harlan of Pebbleton, Sigfrid Stonetree, Menna Merlin. The other was a single torn square of sailcloth with 3 words carved into it with a fishbone. "The sea hates." Asha snorted at that and said, "So do we. That is why we are its children. We understand a parent's moods." She sent back to Pike a little wooden toy, a ship with a stag painted on its sail, a kraken on the hull, because sometimes mockery was better than anger and easier to repeat in a tavern. Theon ran messages when legs were better than wings. He learned the winter paths he had once run as a boy at Winterfell, when he thought he was a prince and his blood warmed him without effort. He learned to mark the blue shadows under crust for what they were. At Carlin Bay he stood on black sand with the sea eating at it, and he watched an Ironborn netting crew pull cod as long as a man's arm from surf that foamed like a dog's jowls, and he tasted salt on a woman's lips when she kissed the air near his cheek, and did not kiss him because she did not know if his name would sour her mouth. At a small hall in the crook of 2 hills, where the snow piled 6 men deep before the hearth and froze hard enough at night that a man could walk across it to get to his own bed and back again just for fun. He drank a sour beer with a glover who had once sworn to lie down at his feet and eat dirt rather than shake his hand, and that glover shook his hand, and that glover shook his hand and ate dirt rather than shake his hand, and that glover... He slept under furs that smelled of a bear's life, and woke with a little girl's hand resting lightly on the missing parts of his own, as if by touching them she could learn where the boundaries of a story lay. Elizen Mormont taught a dozen Ironborn girls to plant and pull a spear without dropping it, and to carve sigils on their hafts with the tip of a braiding pin. Asha taught a dozen Northmen boys to tie a bowline one-handed and to spit over the rail without doing it in the wind. Someone called them sister schools, and the name stuck. An old man at Bear Island who had never left his own shore made a series of obscene jokes about bears and krakens that had even Davos smiling into his cup. And when a younger man bristled and said he did not care to hear filthy talk about his mother, the old one thumped his cane and told him that if he cared enough to punch an old man for talking, he could care enough to bring that old man more next time, because the cold had no respect for a man's age. In all these little ways, the truce went from a thing written on wax and wood to a thing that could be stepped on without it breaking. And Theon felt something like a new muscle growing in the part of him where shame had lived alone. One night, when the wind had scoured the sky so clear that the stars seemed 1,000 ships sailing fast and silent, Theon went back to the tree. The hearths were banked down behind him, and the snores crept under the tent wall like tame beasts that had learned their master's whistle. He knelt again, and this time, there were no words to say, and he did not mind. He put his forehead to the bark and felt the roughness tell him the shape of his own skin. When he lifted his head, he found Asha leaning against a pine, watching him with her arms locked tight across her chest. "We grew up on a rock," she said. "I never thought I would see you love a tree." "I don't love it," he said. "Ah," she said. "So, this is what liking looks like on you. It is not so terrible. I am trying to hold a thing in my hands that is not a knife." "And not a rope," he said. "This feels like that." She came to him then, and put her forehead lightly against his. As men do with wolves, they have known too long to fear. "I will tell you a thing you pretend not to know," she said. "They will not forgive you. Not truly. You will find those with softer places, and those who can forget by living long, and you will find those who love the idea of a man who breaks and stands anyway. But they will not forgive. You must stand anyway." "I will," he said, "if I am permitted to stand." "You are," she said, "by me. You are my brother, and that is a harsh and generous thing. By the bears too, perhaps. By the king, if it makes numbers. The rest," she shrugged, "the rest can come upon us as waves. We will work oars." They stood together like that long enough for the wind to make a new song in the high boughs, a whistling that was not quite music. When they parted, the tongue of the world felt different in Theon's mouth. It was still full of salt and cold, but underneath there was something green that would not leave, though winter gathered itself to a darkness that could stop a man's heart if he let it. The first test came as tests do, without warning that could be used and without mercy that could be thanked. It came as a pale line on the horizon, the sort of dawn you must squint to see as dawn rather than smoke. It came as ravens that did not make sense, beating at tent flaps in the night because they had broken out of cages inland, which only birds who had forgotten humans had ever done before, which only birds frightened past their training did. It came as a fisherman boy with frozen lashes stumbling into Alisana's camp and making a sound when he tried to talk that might have been a laugh and might have been the word cold. They knew, with a knowledge that made even the fiercest of them feel his age, that the dead were walking in the Barrowlands again, and that the cold from beyond had unrolled itself like a carpet, where men had been storing their names in graves since the first men got tired of carrying them. The truce, which had been a careful thing with letters in it, bent. No one asked it if it minded. Asha and Alysanne put their heads together and swore in voices that would make a seal flinch. Stannis drew maps and then burned one or two of them in anger and made new ones on the table with a heel of bread and 2 knives. Davos said, "Boats," and men began moving toward water for no other reason than that they had learned to believe him on the subject of salt. Theon saddled his mare and tightened the cinch with hands that had gone smarter for having fewer fingers. He thought of the little girl asleep with her hand on his stump, and he thought of the old man with the cane laughing at filth, and he thought of a bottle in the sea. At Deepwood they had pledged beneath the face of a god and the smell of brine. On the stony shore they had made their first trade of fish for boards. On Bear Island, a boy who knew no songs but his mother's humming and his sister's cursing had taught an Ironborn girl to clap in a way that made a rhythm, like rowing together. These were not weapons, but they felt like more than nothing. They went south and east into the Barrowlands, where the earth holds old kings like a woman holds seeds in the fold of her dress. The snow was deeper there, and when they came at last to a place where the white lay strangely flattened and the wind would not blow across it, Theon felt something in his body recognize it the way a tongue recognizes a missing tooth. Alysanne lifted her spear and held for a moment. Asha pulled her gloves between her teeth and spat on her palms and put her hands back in. The men with them shifted their feet to keep the blood alive. And then they came, moving like men in a dream, their eyes as empty as calm. Theon knew fear intimately by now, and he greeted it as one might greet a cousin who would borrow everything and never return it. He did not care. He looked down the line of his people and saw a patchwork banner of the living: kraken, bear, stag, the little chalked sigil Davos had given his shore crews, a candle burning against a black square. He thought, "We do not match, but we have learned to row." The first ranks took them like surf, relentlessly, without malice or haste. Steel did what steel does against flesh that had forgotten heat, and for a time the line held, and then pulled back, and then bucked forward again, with a noise like the earth itself was shouting. It became close work, and Theon learned all over that fear goes quiet when a man's arms have more to do than hold it. He watched Alysanne spear a thing through the mouth, and push on until the haft bent, then jerk it free with a snarl. He watched an Ironborn lad swing an axe in a neat circle that took 3 heads and left him blinking at his own competence. He watched Davos take a knife to a throat with a sailor's directness and then step aside as if he had simply cut a rope. They began to fall back. Theon felt it the way a man feels when a boat starts to take water under his feet. You know the sound even if you have never heard it before. Somewhere to his left, there was a woman screaming a name that might have been her child's. He turned toward the sound because that was what he had made up his mind to do now. Not to live, but to turn toward the worst noise and be there. A cold thing came at him with its hands, and he put his stump against its jaw, and drove until its head snapped back, and then he put steel into the place where its voice would have been. He did not think the tree had heard him when he had spoken to it, but he counted himself heard anyway by the face of the world. He counted that he had been answered in the simplest way, with the opportunity to stand. A horn blew. It was not a northern horn. It was not one he had heard from Stannis men, or even from old lords of Winterfell, who knew which note called which kind of dog. It was a horn that wrapped iron around the air. The dead paused as if listening. Asha's head snapped toward the sound. Alysanne swore in a way that told Theon she knew something he did not, and hated that she did. The horn sounded again, and the sound made him want to put his hands over his ears, because it was too big for the world. On the far ridge, a line of black sails sharpened itself against the winter light, where no sails should be. They were not on water. They were on sledges. On sledges men could pull, and oxen could pull, and monsters could pull, if they had them. And Theon saw too many shapes to say with comfort what kind of creature had stooped into those harnesses. The sails snapped and filled with wind that should not have been there. The first of the sledges came down the slope with a soft roaring, snow kicking up like surf, a wave of iron and wood and stubborn intent. Theon narrowed his eyes and tasted bile and a kind of fierce joy that comes to men who were born for a fight and had been kept from it too long by their own mistakes. "Euron," Asha said, as one would say the name of the storm that takes a fleet. "Crow's eye. The sea hates, and so does our blood." She spat into the snow as if she could spit him back into the water. He came for the truce, because the truce is a thing he cannot stand. He came to break what we made because breaking is what men like him love. Theon looked at the line of the dead and the line of the sledges, and felt something very calm sit down inside him like a man at a chessboard. He smiled the old smile he had not known his face could make anymore, the one that had made Robb Stark laugh and push him and say, "Gods, Theon, you always grin at the worst time." He said to no one and to everyone, "Good. Then we will hold it. Hold the truce itself like a shield. And if he rams it, we will let the shock go through our arms and not to our hearts." Men looked at him, some baffled, some with the sudden trust people put in a voice that has forgotten to lie. He lifted his sword. He found it lighter than it had been in memory. which could have been a trick of cold or a trick of truth. "Row," he said, because he had learned that men needed words even when they were standing still in the snow with spear and axe. "Row like you have no oars and only your feet. Row like oarsmen who have the habit of living. Row toward each other." The first sledge struck the line of the dead like a ship cutting through a school of fish, and the dead swarmed it and clung. An Ironborn on the sledge hacked at them with the tidy work of men who had spent their lives leaning into weight. Behind them came others, and a line of bear women with spears went running in their wake like surf. And the living made space the way a boat makes a lane in water. Davos' candle burned against the black of the air on a banner as if in scorn of cold. Elizen Mormont roared like the animal whose name she bore and cut something in half that had once been a boy and never would be again, and she did not cry. Asha leapt from the sled to the churned snow with a knife in each hand and laughed despite it all. A sharp sound that was not happy and not despairing, but something that said, "We are still here." Theon moved forward into the press and found places where his blade fit perfectly, as if the world had grown for it. They did not win. That was not possible. Not against a tide like winter with a horn calling storms to heel. But they did not lose. They held long enough to pull the living behind them. Held long enough to drag a boy and 2 girls and a woman with her apron full of bread back through the line. Held long enough to pull a man with eyes that had already started to cloud into the circle and cut his head free of the wrong body it was attached to. They held and then retreated well, which is its own victory, as shipmasters know when wind and tide decide to argue with their plans. When they had gone far enough to breathe again with lungs that worked and not simply tore. When they had found a little fold in the earth to make the dead start to spill and trip and tangle. When night came on with the suddenness of a door slammed, the horn sounded again above them, 3 notes this time like a sneer. The sledges gathered themselves and turned their black sails against a wind that Theon could feel only as a cold finger on his neck, and they drew back up the ridge without sound. The dead stood and watched and did not pursue. And then the snow began to fall in earnest big flakes like goose down that filled the air between thoughts. They made camp without talking much. Asha's hands shook once when she tried to light a wick, and she cursed. And Theon covered her hands with his, the palms warm enough to share, and the wick took fire. Davos sat with his back against a post and shut his eyes briefly, in the manner of a man counting the places he did not hurt more than he did. Elizen stood a long time at the edge of the light and looked in the direction the sledges had gone, and her face was a thing of bone and rage and calculation. Stannis stood and did not sit, and was a man with numbers in his head, and fires at his back, and a winter at his front that had learned to spell his name. Theon ate a piece of bread that tasted of smoke and salt and joy, because he had not thought to taste it again. He lay down with his cloak over him, and sleep came like a slow tide. He did not fight it. Before it took him, he saw in his mind's eye the weirwood's face and the drowned god's cold green light, and he imagined them looking at each other across a stretch of night, like 2 old men at a tavern table, who had decided at last that neither one would win and that there was more beer in arguing than there was in hatred. He smiled without showing his teeth and let the tide roll in. In the morning, there were fresh prints at the edge of the camp. A fox, 2 hares, the stagger of a man who had gotten up and gone a little ways, and then decided not to leave his life quite yet. The snow on the ridge where the sledges had climbed was smoothed by wind, and nothing held there but the echo of the horn that Theon could still feel in the hinge of his jaw. They went on. The truce went with them like a banner that looked at first glance too small and too patched to be of use, and then kept the rain off in a sudden squall, or found its way around an awkward corner. The children of the shore and the children of the trees learned to swap jokes and insults as easily as they had once swapped blows. There were more blows coming. The world had not even begun to empty its sack of them, but there were oars now too. And Theon, who had once been too light to stand where the sand was soft, put his weight down into the earth and found that it held. He found that when he spoke quietly, men heard, and when he listened, women told him things he needed to know. And when he stood in the line with his blade in his hand and the cold came to take him into its endless house, he said no and meant it. Snow fell and was shoveled and fell and became hard and then softer again. Rivers slowed and thickened and then cracked like old skin. Men wrote new letters and new oaths and new names for their boys, names that made room for the sea and for the woods both. The ravens flew and sometimes came to hand and sometimes did not. The horn did not sound again for a handful of days, and in those quiet, men mended the edges of their fear, and women sharpened the tips of it until it could be thrust into the next thing that came howling. On a cold, bright afternoon, Theon went alone to the heart tree at Deepwood, and stood there while the wind traced the shape of his ears and nose. He did not kneel. He did not speak. He stood and breathed and watched the sap that had frozen red in a kind of eternal fall from the carving's eyes, and thought that perhaps forgiveness was a word for a different thing than he had thought. Perhaps it was not a washing clean at all, but a bearing, in the way a ship bears a weight and does not founder, in the way a tree bears ice on its branches without snapping. Perhaps it was simply this: to stand with others under a sky that hated you all equally and say, together, no. He felt the sea and the wind again then, and smiled because he knew that winter had not swallowed that taste. Not yet. Far away, invisible through the pines and the town and the white, something moved on the water. A boat, a bottle, a darkness that looked like a sail. He had time still, he thought. Time to make his arms hard in the right work, and to feed the truce with his body as if it were a fire. He had time to speak before swords, and time to hold a line after. He had time for now to be a brother to his sister, and a useful enemy to his enemies, and a man to a tree that did not know his name. So he stood until the last of the light found him, and made use of him, and then left him. And then he turned back toward the camp where the banners waited with their patched seams and cockeyed clenches. He went toward the sound of someone singing badly. One of Davos' men, he thought, trying to teach a Bear Island tune to a boy who only knew waves. And he let himself learn the refrain as he walked, humming under his breath the way you do when you are tired and well used and there is work yet to do, and you are irrationally glad for. Okay. The snow squeaked beneath his boots in the way it does when night has kept its teeth in it, and the humming fell into that rhythm without his thinking. In the glow of the nearest brazier, a man with a bear on his shoulder was untangling a net of horsehair and rawhide, his fingers cracked and deft. Davos had a bowl in his hands that steamed faintly and smelled of onion despite there being no onions to be had. He nodded at Theon and tilted the bowl, and then passed it wordless. It was only hot water that had met a bone for a moment and remembered the encounter, but the heat went down to his belly and stayed there like a coin you did not want to spend. We held, Davos said at last. He had wrapped his voice in something for the night. So it did not carry. That will taste like victory to a man who hasn't had any. It tastes like not being dead, Theon said. Which is a victory I understand. Your sister fights like a sailor, Davos said, a smile tugging. All wrists and ankles and never where you think. She learned early that ships and men can both throw you, Theon returned. He crouched, bowl in both hands. What do your numbers say? That we will feed this camp for 12 days with what floats in and what we can take without the boats grounding, Davos said. He never made a mystery of his figures. He tipped them out like coins for any man to count. After that, we chew harness. Unless the whitebacks show and we chew them instead. And unless our new friends in the coves do what they've sworn. Your Botleys, the good brothers, the others with more sea in their names than sense. They will, Theon said. If only to prove the North wrong. That is a reason, Davos allowed. I've seen worse reasons carry men further than they meant to go. He lifted his chin toward the dark beyond the brazier's reach. You should sleep. I will, Theon said, falling into the verb like a man falling into water. He closed his eyes and found salt there, which could have been memory, or could have been tears the wind had stolen from someone else's face and put on his. He did not examine the source. He slept the way men sleep after noise has carved everything out of them that can be carved, a blankness like the sea before a storm. At dawn, the wind shifted from north-northeast to west, mild as a change of mind. The sea took a breath. A messenger from Lordsport came on a pony with legs thick as a cooper's arms and a temper to match. She slid down from the saddle with a face chapped to blood and put a folded scrap into Asha's hand, then stood there grinning until she was given bread because she was young and had been taught by women who did not waste. Asha read the letters with her mouth trying on 3 expressions and choosing none. She passed the scrap to Theon last. The words were careful and unflowery, but they had the reader's inky smell about them. We consider your proposals with gravity becoming the winter and the dead. There was a list of names that could be trusted, with small sharp notes next to each. This one drinks too much but loves his children. This one hates snow and will say anything to be moved south. This one is a fool but follows fools further to keep them from falling. There was a postscript in a smaller hand that Theon knew for Roderick Harlaw's niece, the girl who wore spectacles and maps in her head as if her skull were their case. Crow's Eye sail seen east of Great Wick, with trophies that cannot be spoken of in a letter. He has a thing that makes men forget what they promised on land. Your speed is your advantage. Do not let him own the horn you mean to sound. We go, Asha said, even before Stannis sent for her. She did not look to Theon when she said it, but he felt included in the we of it, in a way that made the world sit straighter. By noon, a longship was skidding down a timbered ways, its hull greased with tallow and ash, and Ironborn hands pushed and shouted and laughed, because a ship that finds water under it is a kind of joke between lover and beloved. The sea took her with a thump and an indrawn breath, and then rocked her like a woman soothing a child with other business in her eyes. Alysanne came to the quay with 2 of her spearwomen in winter cloaks, and a look like flint. If you come back with fewer heads than you set out with, she said to Asha, I will take the difference in ears. If we come back with more, will you keep them for us? Asha returned, barbed and bright. Alysanne's pale eyes shifted to Theon. Bring me back a promise I can show to men who have buried brothers for the sake of a salt wind. Bring me back a reason to tell them to lower their spears when a black-sailed thing shows in the mouth of their coves. Then, I will bring you back a boat, Theon said, and found the words fit his mouth snug. One that obeys our truce. He was not sure until he heard himself that he meant Euron's. Alysanne's mouth twisted. Do it, and I will tell my girls to stop scowling at your men when they sing. She clapped him once on the shoulder, firm enough to sting. Go. They went. The longship's oars bit slow at first, then fell into a rhythm old as the first song a woman sings to a baby. The winter sea was ironed flat in places, and rucked up like a carpet in others. It could not make up its mind whether to smile or remember its wrath. Asha stood in the prow with one hand around the stem like a lover's wrist, eyes narrowed at the line between sky and water. Theon took his place where a useful man finds it, at the second oar on the starboard, his stump wrapped in wool and leather that smelled of smoke. The cold traveled up his bones and he let it come. It was better than the other cold. They made Lordsport in 2 tides, the second of them meaner and more opinionated, the kind that likes to argue with a man's judgment of distance. The harbor had a rim of old ice in it like an old man's lip, and the fish stink had gone high in the noses of the townsfolk, because winter makes of every smell a banner. The reader's men waited in the boathouse with spears stacked neat and a brazier giving off thin heat. There were bowls on a shelf that had more cracks than glaze. Roderick Harlaw himself stood where a man could stand and see most of the room and most of the water too. He was tall still, though he stooped, and the white of his hair made the black of his eyes deeper. He took Asha's hand and then Theon's, and held both for a moment a fraction too long, as if reminding himself what each felt like, so that if one was taken from him, he would know which it was. "You've brought winter into our hall," he said. "We were already full of it. We will have to tidy. We brought a way to make it think twice," Asha said. "And we brought a king's rope and a bear's spear and a candle. We are making a ship out of them." "Ma'am?" Roderick's mouth did that thing it did when it smiled without appearing to. "My niece says you are making a raft," he said. "I tell her that a raft is only a boat with poor manners. It still floats." There were other men there who mattered in smaller ways. Menna Merlin, whose hands were too elegant for the iron she worked, and who wrote a better hand than most clerks at Old Town. Harlan of Pebbleton, who had the look of a man who had beaten an ox because it wouldn't move, and then cried afterward. Two good brothers with the same nose like a blunt instrument, one 4 inches shorter than the other and more dangerous. They made the gestures that opened a meeting and that would have seemed laughable in summer. The tasting of salted water, the touching of a knife blade to a finger and the finger to the forehead. The glance toward the cat sitting on the shelf, as if its indifference constituted a kind of blessing. Theon felt the old comfort of those rituals, like a song you didn't know you knew until your mouth made it. Aeron came without trumpet, because trumpets were for men who believed they could call others to heal without drowning them first. He stepped from the shadow near the door, as if the room had not noticed it had been holding him. His beard was a wet rope, and his eyes were the deep brown of algae where it grows on a piling that has stood 10 winters. Theon smelled salt and old faith. The priest looked first to Asha and then to Theon, and there was something like grief in the way he did not look away. "You would sell the sea for bread," he said. His voice had not lost the water in it. "You would drink the ocean with your hands until you choke, and then ask the green to forgive your thirst." "We would drink with cups instead of hands," Asha said. "So less is spilled, and we would give some to men on another shore who might row when our arms are weak." "The god does not ask you to row," Aeron said. "He asks you to drown and rise again. He asks you to forget that a man can bargain with winter." "He also asks us to drink," Theon said, surprising himself. "And to eat. Men who drown do not need bread." The room listened, the way rooms do when men who do not often quarrel gently begin to. There is a way to be his children and still live long enough to teach others his name. You have seen that way in your dreams and in your breath, Aeron. You have seen it when you held your head under and heard the wave tell you you were nothing. It is one thing to be nothing. It is another to make others nothing with you when you might make them some. Aeron did not strike him, though the past would have allowed it. He did not call for salt and pull Theon under in front of men, though the past would have egged him. He looked instead at Roderick. "You study paper as if it can hold a man," he said, contempt threaded with affection. "Tell me where a sheet can stop a sword." "It can stop a hand," Roderick said. "Sometimes that is all you need for a moment. And because moments make the world, I tell you that words hold. Not as iron holds perhaps, but iron rusts. Paper burns, but it can be copied. This winter we'll need all our tricks." Euron's presence was a smell before it was a sight. It was the stink of a ship that had sailed too far into places where water is not water, and men are not men, and had come back with something in its seams. The door did not open wide for him. He made the gap big by being in it. He looked younger than he should have and older than a man can afford to, all at once. The patch over his eye had been a joke once. Now it seemed a mercy. He had dressed for a wedding no one had invited him to. In black, in such a perfect shade, it made the coals look sick. His mouth was a cut that healed badly. The pleasure in it did not ask permission. "Nieces," he said, and made the word do something to the air. "Nephew, reader, priest, makers of rafts and of rules, I have brought you a horn to blow when your paper fails." He lifted it from under his cloak like a conjurer. It was black as if it had learned the trick of swallowing light. It was banded with metal that was not iron, and not any gold Theon had seen. It smelled faintly of burned bone, and an old, sweet rot. Aeron's eyes widened and he said a word Theon had not known the Damfair to know. "No." He said it 3 times, each quieter than the last, as if he were telling himself to hear. Asha's jaw set, and she did not look at the horn, refusing even to give it an enemy's attention. Roderick moved his lips through a line of some old poem about storms that he had taught the children in his hall. Euron smiled. "It does not bind dragons," he said pleasantly. "I am not so foolish as to boast that kind of prize to the family common room. It binds wind, and it binds men. It will call a storm through a keyhole. It will make the best captain the gods ever gave us forget he ever bent knee to a truce that smells of trees. Blow it, Aeron. Blow it, and remember, you were born to drown others." "Menamau." "No," Aeron said again. Softer, his hand rising as if to make the sign of his god, and then stopping halfway, fingers tremoring. "No horn I have not blessed will bless me." "Then bless it," Euron said, sardonic and hungry. "Bless it with your breath. Let me hear the god's wet voice through it." Asha moved first. She did not leap like a foolish girl at a snake. She did the thing a captain does in a crowded deck fight. She took a half step and put her hand on the wrist that held the danger, and turned the body attached to it, so that the danger pointed at nothing a man would be sorry to lose. It was equal parts dance and insult. Euron's mouth twitched in admiration before it drew further back in delight at the thought of breaking such tidy work. Theon went at the elbow, because Asha had taught him on a deck how weak men are where they hinge. He moved without thinking, hips first, arms second, stump last. Roderick did not move as quickly as he had when he was younger, but he had chosen where to stand, and that did most of his moving for him. He raised the nearest bench as if it had been carved for that moment and not for sitting, and he brought it up between Euron and Aeron, the way a man brings up a shield in an alley when a dog rushes you. The horn's mouth knocked the bench and sang one short note like a fishbone caught in a throat. The fire in the brazier shivered. Men at the back of the room took an involuntary step, then another. Euron laughed quietly. "So the raft has oars," he said. "How clever. I will break them and you will float with your hands. Get out," Asha said. She did not raise her voice. She pushed his wrist another inch and made the horn point at the cat, which had made itself bigger in the manner of cats and did not care. Euron cocked his head. "Say, please." "Please," Asha said with a smoothness Theon loved her for and hated. "Please leave your toy and your eye and anything else you forgot to drown, and go." "I will go," he said amused. "I have sledges to polish and men to separate from their promises. You will see me again, on a day like a wound. Blow your raft's horn then." He let the wrist turn under Asha's hand and let the horn drop back under the cloak, the way a man lets a lover's hand go where it has meant to go all along. He regarded Theon for a moment longer than was comfortable. "You have learned to stand still, little fish," he said. "Be careful. Men who stand too long forget how to swim." He was gone in the way men like him leave, with a whiff of their next trouble in their wake. The room breathed. Aeron put his hands over his ears as if that could push the remembered note back out. The reader's eyebrows had come to a place above his eyes Theon would not have believed possible. Theon had not realized he had been biting the inside of his cheek until he tasted blood and found the taste cheering. "We do not have much time," Asha said. "He will burn for the joy of it and call it righteousness. We must bind more men with our paper before he unbinds the ones we have." "Then do it," Roderick said. "Do it as if the world depends on dull seals and the right sort of rope." "It might." Mendamnair. They made an exchange in that cold harbor that would have startled children in summer and only wrung a nod from winter. 3 boys and a girl from the best houses of the islands, Merlin, good brother, Stone Tree Volmark, stepped forward with their chins up and their eyes elsewhere, as if looking at the future over the shoulders of the men in front of them. In return 4 Northborn wards, with cheeks red from wind and mother's tears shining in their eyes, stepped aboard a longship for the first time, and did not disgrace themselves by vomiting immediately. Theon watched their little hands grip unfamiliar ropes, and felt a tenderness he did not want to inspect. He remembered himself small and thin, and too quick with his teeth, shoved onto a shore where the trees made him feel watched. He lifted his hand when one of the boys, Gorwyn Stonetree, proud as a mast, looked at him for a measure of instruction, and made a small twist with his wrist that would save him a blister later. The boy's fingers obeyed, grateful despite themselves. Aeron stood aside, neither blessing nor cursing, a man in the small space between what he had wanted and what the wave gave. Euron was wind, not present in the flesh, but in every man's cheek where the cold bit deeper. They broke bread as law demanded and salted the children's tongues as hospitality demanded. The girls of Bear Island who had come with Alysanne fumbled less with the ship's lines than the North boys. They had been plaiting nets and pulling keels up shingle since they could carry a basket together. When the moment for weeping came, the women took it like a draught of something that scalds and then warms, with their heads tipped back and their throats bare in defiance of whatever might think to cut them there. The weather closed its teeth for the return, as if offended by the audacity of men who thought they could do more than go from one small fire to another. Spindrift hardened into pellets that stung, and then melted, and then stung again. Asha made them shorten the oars and keep their cadence. Theon found the rhythm that had been in his bones since childhood. The Northwards learned quickly. Fear is a teacher that does not require payment afterward. Gorwyn Stonetree sang a filthy song he had learned on a quay at Pike, and one of Elizana's girls corrected his words to make them northerly filthy. Men laughed even with ice forming in their beards. The thing that waits beyond the wall of the world did not show its face on that tide. Back at Deepwood, there was a supper of things scraped together into a miracle. A stew with fish, oats, cabbage, a bit of old boar, a handful of something that tasted green, though every green thing died 2 moons ago. Men ate bent over their trencher and did not speak, because food has its own language. After, in the ebb of the noise, Stannis stood and told them what he meant to do with the Dreadfort. He spoke like a man reads from a ledger. "We cannot break it with rams in this deep cold," he said. "The wood will do as the men do when you strike it too often. It will break where it should bend. We cannot starve it out in time to make a difference to the greater war." He meant the cold and the dead, but he did not name them. Kings sometimes think that naming gives strength to the enemy, and sometimes they are right. We can make it send its men to chase us and then break them in the field, which it does not love to do. It likes walls. We will build something on the water that will make it believe its walls matter less. Davos nodded. Asha narrowed her eyes and began to count something on her fingers. Theon saw it then, like a map a boy draws with a stick in wet sand. The weeping water sluggish and low, its skin thick enough to bear a man, and not enough to bear a horse. The estuary like a throat. "Rafts," he said, low and soft, with skins against the scrape and men who know the water that isn't water. He looked at Asha and saw the idea catch and become captain-shaped. Not to go through the walls, to go under them, to go to where the moat meets the river and the river doesn't know the difference, to put fire where the stones don't know how to bear it. Menamishan. Stannis' mouth twitched in what, on another face, would have been a smile. "Yes," Elizan snorted. "Men and their fire. We will need rope. We will need good hands. We will need to make the Boltons wake up in a bed they did not choose." Davos spread his hands. "Rope we can find. Hands we are teaching. The bed I leave to you, my lady." They set to it with the calm that men find when they are given a task too big to panic at all at once. The Ironborn warped timbers and talked to the water like an old ant with more advice than teeth. The Northmen cut skins and greased them and swore that if the thing did not float, they would march it to the Dreadfort and beat its lord with it. Asha set small crews to practice in the shallows where no glory could be found, and therefore competence might. Theon paired boys who had never seen rope, used for anything but hanging, with men who had used it for everything else. He taught them the trick of listening to what tension says through hemp. He watched a Mormont girl, scarcely to his waist, put her foot on a raft's edge and say, "No," when it tried to slide away with her balance, and the raft listened, remembering that courage has weight. While they built, Euron worked his own craft. There were fires where no fire should have found wood to bite. There were doors opened in the night that no man admitted opening, and yet swung on oiled hinges to let wolves in. There were 2 boats at Whitefish Bay that went out to cast nets, and came back with their crews' mouths sewn shut, and their eyes alight with a joy that was not their own. Elizan took one look and made a fist before she made a plan. Davos put his palm against one man's cheek and said his name the way a father does, and the thread trembled, but did not break. Theon stood in front of a boy of 14 years who had helped him carry oars as a child at Lordsport, and he saw the sewn mouth turn up in a smile around the needlework. And he felt something in him go quiet and unspeakable. They put those men in a tent warm to spring and set women to singing, and still it took 2 days for them to remember their own names enough to untie their lips with their own hands. The thread came out like a line pulled from a fish's mouth. "This is what he throws at a truce," Asha said. "Raw.u. He will not rest until we fight the men we meant to call brothers. Then we will keep them where his thread cannot reach," Theon said. "We will tell each other's stories louder." They did it clumsily at first and then less clumsily. They made a practice of telling at every campfire one tale of a wrong done by Ironborn to Northmen, and answered it with a wrong done by Northmen to Ironborn, and then told a third story of a kindness where a boat had been pulled off a rock, or a baby had been kept warm with the skin of a beast someone else had killed. It did not balance. Men like to weigh their hurts and have the scales come true. The scales never do. But the third story was a hand on the beam, keeping it from tipping so far that the dinner slid into the ashes. The wards learned. On Bear Island, a Merlin girl wrote her name with a Northman's alphabet, and then wrote it with rope on a rail so a boy could read it with his fingers. In Lordsport, a Glover boy learned that a wind from the west means different things depending on the shape of the headland you hide behind, and he learned the names of headlands the way he had learned the names of hills. He learned to curse the sea with gentle words so it would know he was not afraid. He learned the game of throwing shells into a pot at 20 paces, which was really a game about aim and a crosswind. He learned to sleep in a hammock without waking upside down. He wrote a letter home that smelled of tar and the inside of a chest, and his mother cried over it, and then laughed because he had drawn a picture of a boat that looked like a carrot with teeth. When the rafts were ready, they were not beautiful. They were brown things that sat sullenly in the shallows, and then, when asked, went downriver as if it had been their idea. Asha stood on the first with her knees bent the way a captain's knees bend to hear the talk of the water. Davos went with her because he was stubborn about his right to be in the wrong place at the necessary time. Theon took the third raft. On the second went a man from the Dreadfort's kitchens who had slipped out one night with the taste of fear thick in his mouth, and the memory of this bend and that low place under the wall where rats talk. Elisen watched from the bank with 24 spears and an expression like a promise. On the far side of the river, 3 good archers lay with their faces in the snow and their bows under their bellies to keep the strings dry. They went at night when the air was so still even the ice did not tinkle, when the only sound was the river remembering warmer times in a low murmur under its skins. The stars were a spill of meal from a torn bag. The world had that quality it gets when a man knows he can be heard being afraid by things that do not breathe. The rafts bumped and hissed and were quiet. The nearest walls of the Dreadfort rose out of black like the edge of a lid being set down on a pot, a circle meant to keep heat in and men out. Light pulsed in 2 slits where guards stood with torches. The vents where warm air leaves and cold air wants to enter were little black mouths feathered with frost. The man from the kitchen slid over the side without a splash, which is a thing accomplished by saints or those who have been hungry too long. He put his hands under the rim of ice where it met stone and found the seam he had remembered. He whispered something that sounded like a prayer but had no God's name in it. Asha whispered back, and it did not either. They set the first bladder of oil and wrapped it against the stone the way a woman fastens a babe against her chest. They set the second and the third and moved without breath, because breath fogs and fog tells tales. Davos glanced once at Theon, and Theon knew the glance. If we die, it will be for a better reason than we used to give ourselves. When the first soft pop came, it was the small sound of fat in a pan. When the second followed, the little mouths of the vents coughed as if clearing their throats. The third gave a hack like an old man with a winter in him. The fourth and fifth were real fire, fire that has found material to love. It climbed inside the wall where men had thought the cold would keep it asleep, and it found dry lint, and it found mice nests, and it found the places where men had not cleaned, because men never cleaned the places they do not see. The torches on the wall jerked. A voice called, muffled and foolish. Another voice called, angrier. The sixth pop was a humph, and the seventh was a low roar, like a laughing cousin to the horn Euron had brought in his cloak. Elisen's arrows thrummed out of the dark, and men on the wall made the faces men make when they do not understand why their lives are not continuing as expected. Asha put her palm down, and the rafts pushed away with a thought. Davos counted under his breath in some dockside catechism that kept his heart from running out of his body. Theon reached with his stump without thinking, and pressed it into the river skin, the way a man presses his hand to a child's hair to tell it to hush. The river hushed. Behind them, the Dreadfort woke to a problem that could not be solved with insults and a lashing. It would not fall to this. Theon had never believed it would. But stone that has been embarrassed by fire loses some of its pride, and men do too. In the morning, there would be smoke that would curl and cry. There would be men sulking at their lord for having allowed his house to cough like a sick cow. There would be, in a week, a sally by proud fools who would come out to chase bears and krakens and candles and stag signs, and they would find a field where the snow is not their friend and where men who had learned to row toward each other would be waiting. They slipped back to the bank as the sky thought about pink. The spears took them into their circle and hid them under anger and laughter, and the kind of praise that is only evident when men insult each other with love. Alysanne did not smile. She stared upriver at the faint thread of smoke that was all their sin made visible, and then nodded once, as if that thread had replied to some question she had been asking it since she was a child with a stick and a sealed blubber lamp. "They will come," she said. "Then we will meet them," Asha answered. "Row," Theon murmured, old habit turning in his mouth, and men took up the word without knowing they had. A hum under their breath that kept the pulse of the camp even while they slept. Euron tried to snap the truce in half with a trick that would have worked if men had not begun to like the taste of their own cleverness. He sent 3 boats under his own black sails to a north hamlet that had not yet learned to read a truce with its eyes. He filled them with men from far, men whose tongues had been cut and whose ears were pierced through with rings of some metal that did not catch the brazier's light. They came at moonset and took 2 sheep and 1 girl and a barrel of cider. And in the morning the hamlet woke and found the marks of their boots and began to shout for blood. Theon arrived with a sled, Asha at his side, Alysanne a step behind, and he knelt and touched the impressions in the snow and said, loudly and carefully, "These are not our boots." He pointed where the nails were set in the soles. Too close, too many. He pointed where the stride was wrong, for men used to the rise and fall of a deck. He pointed where an axe had been carried at the wrong hip for an Ironborn. He said the word Euron last, like a curse. "How do we know you speak truth, Greyjoy?" a man shouted from the back. "Which is where truth comes from most mornings." His beard had ice in it and anger under it. "Because I hate the man who did this more than you can afford to," Theon said. And the crowd liked that, because hatred is coin both parties understand. "Because I have put my hand on a thing that makes him shut his mouth, and it is this." He lifted his stump and bared it. "You can hang me later if I lie. You can hang me now if you like. But listen to my sister first." He stepped back because he knew when to give the deck to the only captain there. Asha spoke with her head bare to the cold. "We will bring the girl back," she said. "Or we will bring you the men who took her with their mouths open and their eyes empty, so you may see what they were and decide what you will do with them. If you lift a hand against any man who came to you with a truce sealed and a rope around his pride, I will cut your hand off at the wrist and make a meat of it for the dogs. Look at me, Northmen." She turned her face. It had 3 scars now, and a crease that winter would make permanent. "I do not smile as some women do to make men soft. I am not your sister, but I will be your shield if you will be mine." They did not cheer. Cheering is for summer. But the sound they made then was the sound of men whose throats had remembered how to say yes without liking anything about it. It was enough. They got the girl back at dusk 3 days later, from a cove where the water went under a rock like a thought, and the ice had made itself into a little palace that would kill a child for touching it. The men who had taken her had their mouths sewn shut again, and their eyes wept even as whatever joy Euron had put there tried to grin. Alysanne cut the thread with a gentleness Theon had not expected from her knives. The girl breathed like a rabbit. When she saw the gray of Asha's cloak, she flinched and then lifted her chin because someone had taught her that the only way to beat fear is to make it ashamed. Asha bowed to her as one captain bows to another when 2 ships pass at sea and do not fire. Theon went to the tree again because he had taken to doing that when he had put too much of the world's salt on his tongue. He did not talk. He did not need to. He stood with his hands open at his sides. Snow fell softly, patient. A raven, in a dangling branch, said a word that might have been his name, if a bird could remember a thing long enough to mean it. He felt the cold go into his scars and come out the other side, and he thought of hands he had shaken and mouths he had closed and opened. He thought of Robb Stark laughing and sidestepping a swing in a practice yard, of Bran's small foot on a rung, of Sansa's neat needlework and Arya's untidy courage, of the burnt smell that had followed him like a shame, of the heat of the little girl's hand on his missing parts. He thought of Asha's forehead resting against his, of Davos' soft counting, of Stannis' mouth when it almost smiled, and then, righteous, decided not to. He thought of Euron's horn, the way it wanted to ask questions his soul did not have answers for. He breathed. He told the tree nothing. He hoped it understood everything. When the Bolton men came out of their coffing house to chase pride back into their chests, they met rafts on a river that had learned to hold weight, and they met spears that were not impressed by flayed men on banners, and they met arrows that did not miss because the women who loosed them had been choosing fish out of nets since their wrists could turn without thought. They met a line where Ironborn and Northborn had found that a shoulder feels the same whether it was made on Bear Island or Pike, when pressed against another in a press of dying. The fight was the sort that blurs into noise, and then into a quiet afterward that rings, and it left the snow brown and stiff and slick. The Boltons did not learn humility. That is not a lesson men like that keep. But they learned to look back at their walls with less love, and to look at their lord with less certainty that his skin's color gave them destiny. In the night after, the horn sounded again on a far ridge. Men looked up from their bowls and their wounds and frowned as if someone had told a poor joke. Theon tilted his head because he had begun to be able to sift Urin's toys from the other noises the world made. This was not the sledges. This was the sound a man makes when he finds a seam in a thing he didn't build and pulls because the sound of ripping is his favorite. It rolled over the field and went away again. No snow devils danced at its call. No men stood up against their will and went walking into ice. Not that night. He slept and dreamed of a shore where waves came in black and went out blacker and left behind on the sand the shapes of oarsmen made of salt. In the dream he walked among them and told them stories he had memorized at fires. Of a girl who had come back from a stitch, of a boy who had tied his name in rope, of a bear who had taught a kraken to clap in time. The salt men listened as if they had ears. In the morning he told no one the dream, because dreams are either burdens or tools, and he did not yet know which this one would be. The truce held because men held it. It had no magic in it. It tied neither horns nor kings. It was a patch on a sail that still drew wind. It tore. They mended it. It sagged. They pulled it tight. A man from the rills brought a cow to the shore and traded it for fish. A girl from Old Wick sent back a letter with a pressed bit of something green in it, and the woman who received it held it to her nose and cried because it smelled like weed on a wet stone. A bear woman married a man from Orkmont with 3 fingers on his left hand and a laugh everything liked to sit in, and the feast had a stew made entirely of things men caught in winter and called it summer. At that feast, Asha made a joke that made 4 men leave in a temper and come back with firewood because grudges heat you less than actual heat. Aaron drowned a man and pulled him up, and the man coughed and said the name of the god, and then after whispered to Theon that the water had been cold, but it had washed some of the horn's sound out of his head. Roderick Harlaw sent a book up with a man who swore he would carry it under his shirt and not let the snow touch it. When the book arrived, the first page had bled and Davis dried it by the fire with the care of a father with a sick child. And the dead moved, and the cold came, and the world kept its war. But in the corner where 2 winds crossed, iron met fur, and did not splinter. Theon stood in that corner with his blade and his missing parts in his sister's shoulder, and a bear's scowl, and a king's rope and a candle's dull bravery, and he found that he could stay there a very long time. If the wave broke, he would go under, and the drowned god would greet him with old sarcasm and ask him if he had learned to hold his breath. If the tree bent, he would see if it had taught him something about not snapping. He was not anything, he had said once. Now he was something interim. A man between sea and wood, between shame and use, between men who grieved in different languages and men who kept watch in the same. When dawn came pink and mean 2 days after the Dreadfort's vent coughed its last pity, a raven with a strip of sailcloth tied to its leg banged into the side of Alisane's tent, as if it had argued with the wind about which door to use and lost. They cut the cord and unwound the cloth and read the 3 words carved with a fishbone: "The sea waits." Asha laughed like a bark at a bad play that you still enjoy. "He is patient because his cruelty makes patience easier," she said. "We will not be patient because our love makes patience harder. That will be how we beat him." "Bah. How long?" Theon asked, not because he wanted to measure dread, but because he wanted to count the days he could stand. "As long as there are hands," Davos said, not looking up from his inventory. "As long as there is rope, as long as there is wood, as long as there is salt, as long as there is snow," Alyson added, low. which is always. Theon smiled his old wrong smile, and his new right one at once. Row, he said. And if it was prayer or order, the world did not mind. It had heard worse. It bore him up. It bore them all. It did not forgive, but it allowed. And in that small allowance, men found a way to climb from one day to the next. As if the days were rungs on a ladder set against a wall, they meant, together, to scale.